Alaska Statehood and the Impact of Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act is brought to you by the Arctic Slope Regional Corporation.
It was March 30th, 1867, when the United States purchased Alaska from Russia. The two nations agreed that the United States would pay Russia $7.2 million. At less than 2 cents an acre, the United States acquired nearly 600,000 square miles. "92 years would pass before the territory of Alaska would achieve statehood. Judge James Wickersham proposed the first statehood bill to Congress in 1916. The discovery of the Swanson River oil field in the 1950s finally gave the territory the tax base it needed to become a state. A constitutional convention was held to develop a state constitution, and a Statehood Act was passed in 1959. Unfortunately for the Native community, the Statehood Act did not effectively address or preserve Native lands or rights. The Inupiat Eskimos of Alaska's North Slope, realizing that the state of Alaska intended to claim and develop the oil-rich lands of the Arctic Slope, formed the Arctic Slope Native Association, ASNA, in 1965. ASNA's membership claimed Aboriginal title to 56.5 million acres of the petroleum-rich lands encompassing the entire North Slope of Alaska. The Alaska Federation of Natives, AFN, was formed in 1966 to pursue the land claims and the native rights settlement with the federal and state governments. Also in 1966, the claims filed by ASNA resulted in a land freeze issued by the Secretary of Interior, Stuart Udall. The land freeze prevented the transfer of further lands granted to the state of Alaska by the Statehood Act. Udall's land freeze brought an angry response from the state officials. In 1967, Alaska Governor Wally Hickel initiated a lawsuit to force the transfer of lands. Governor Hickel demanded the lifting of the land freeze because the freeze prevented the issuance of oil leases on federal lands, because the state was to receive 90% of royalty revenues from such lands. The state claimed it was losing significant revenues. On March 13, 1968, ARCO, an Humboldt Oil Refining Company, which would later become Exxon, announced the discovery of oil at Prudhoe Bay. The industry and the government began plans for an 800-mile Trans-Alaska pipeline. But native land claims cast a cloud over ownership of land and leases in Alaska. How would pipeline access be gained over land claimed by native groups? Compensation would have to be decided, and a settlement had to be reached with the native people whose land and lives were about to be changed forever. For 4 long years, spirited debate would be focused on just how much land Alaska natives would retain and how much cash they would be granted for the extinguishment of their claims to the land. In 1969, the state of Alaska auctioned lease rights to Prudhoe Bay, generating $900 million. Inupiat and other Alaska Natives, led by Charles E. Edwardson Jr., protested this sale by the state of what they considered to be Arctic Slope Inupiat resources. In 1970, AFN and ASNA increased lobbying efforts in Washington, D.C. for congressional legislation to settle Alaska Native land claims. The huge oil discovery provided the first real incentive and opportunity to reach a federally legislated land claim settlement. The push to build a pipeline from the oil riches discovered at Prudhoe Bay across the state, including lands claimed by Alaska Native groups, would finally lead to a settlement. The Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, ANCSA, is signed into law by President Nixon. The delegates from ASNA voted against supporting the act, and in the end were the only regional Native organization which openly opposed the act. Prior to the passage of ANCSA, the U.S. Congress wanted Alaska Native support and approval of the final act. The AFN gathered delegates from all regions of the state to vote. The Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act was eventually approved by a majority vote of AFN delegates, with only the Arctic Slope delegates opposed. You may ask why Alaska Natives were organized under the corporate form. First, influential Alaska Native leaders and groups wanted to be independent in managing their land and affairs. They were dissatisfied with federal Indian programs. They thought something better than being in a trust relationship and being made wards of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, BIA, should be found. Second, the state and influential members of Congress wanted to prevent establishment of any additional reservations or Indian country in Alaska. Indian country has significant federal protection and almost complete exemption from state government authority. The corporate form would ensure that any new Native entities in Alaska would be subject to state of Alaska jurisdiction.
ANCSA authorized the formation of 12 regional Native corporations and approximately 200 Native village corporations. Later, an additional regional corporation, the 13th Regional Corporation, would be authorized and formed for the benefit of Alaska Natives who lived outside of Alaska at the time of the passage of the Act. The final version of ANCSA would provide for the payment of $962 million and the transfer of 44 million acres of land to the various regional Native corporations formed pursuant to ANCSA. Out of this amount, $500 million would be generated by oil royalties from the North Slope lands, formerly claimed by the Inupiaq people, and the remainder would come from the federal treasury.
ANCSA also contains language requiring regional corporations to distribute 70% of all natural resource revenues among the regional corporations. This provision is called 7I and has generated much litigation regarding exactly what must be distributed.
Eligibility and enrollment into regional corporations pursuant to ANCSA is restricted to any Alaskan Native of at least a quarter Native blood, alive on December 18, 1971. ANCSA excluded anyone born after December 18, 1971, afterborns. However, in 1991, amendments to ANCSA authorized the creation of additional stock to include afterborns as Native corporation shareholders. Each of the regional corporations was given the option to issue additional shares of stock to those afterborn upon the approval of the majority of existing shareholders. Soon after the adoption of these amendments, several ANCSA corporations authorized the enrollment of afterborns, who are now included as shareholders. The Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act is sometimes referred to as a living document and is periodically revised to reflect the changing landscape in Alaska and the needs of the Alaska Native community. Alaska Statehood and the Impact of Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act is brought to you by the Arctic Slope Regional Corporation.